No cameras were present. No aides were listening. But one quiet conversation inside palace walls would ignite a chain reaction no one saw coming. A few carefully chosen words, delivered softly, reached a child who was never meant to carry them. What was said wasn't loud, wasn't cruel on the surface, but its impact detonated like a bomb. And when William discovered what had been whispered to his daughter, fury replaced restraint in a way the palace hadn't witnessed before. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It happened away from corridors and ceremony, tucked into a pocket of time that never appears on official schedules. No record, no witnesses willing to speak on the record, just an encounter framed as ordinary, almost affectionate, yet charged with meaning beneath the calm delivery. For Charlotte, it was simply a conversation with someone she had been taught to respect. For the adults who would later piece it together, it was a moment heavy with consequence, one that should never have involved a child at all. Charlotte did not receive the words as criticism. She received them as information, shaped gently, couched in concern, wrapped in the language of familiarity. That is what made it so dangerous. Nothing sounded harsh. Nothing sounded final. The words suggested rather than stated, hinted rather than accused. They lingered just long enough to create a question where certainty once lived, and then they were gone, leaving a young mind to fill in the gaps on its own. Palace insiders would later describe the exchange in hushed terms, not because of what was explicitly said, but because of what it invited Charlotte to consider. Adults inside the system understood immediately why it crossed a line. Children are not meant to evaluate their parents. They are not meant to carry implied judgments about the people who anchor their sense of safety. And yet, that burden was quietly placed in Charlotte's hands, without ceremony or consent. The subject at the heart of the conversation was never framed as wrongdoing. It was framed as complexity, as absence, as choice. Catherine's role as a mother was not attacked outright, but it was subtly reframed, tilted just enough to introduce uncertainty. It was the kind of suggestion that could not be easily corrected later, because nothing concrete had been said. Only a tone, only a pause, only an idea planted where it did not belong. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Charlotte carried on as children do, outwardly unchanged. But small things shifted. Questions surfaced. Innocent remarks landed with unfamiliar weight, and when those fragments finally reached William, assembled not as accusation but as confusion, something inside him snapped into focus. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not clumsy phrasing. It was a breach quiet, calculated, and profoundly personal. What Charlotte carried away from that moment seemed small at first, but the real damage only became visible when the words finally reached her father. Children don't always repeat what they're told right away. Sometimes they carry it quietly, trying to make sense of feelings they don't yet have language for. That's what made this moment so devastating. What Charlotte eventually shared wasn't framed as an accusation, it came out as confusion, a question, a doubt. And in that instant, William realized someone had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. At first, the change was almost invisible. Charlotte didn't cry, she didn't withdraw. She simply became more thoughtful, more careful with her words, as though she were weighing every sentence before letting it leave her mouth. There were longer pauses where there used to be certainty, small hesitations where confidence once lived. To most, it would have seemed like nothing more than a child growing older. But to parents who knew her rhythm, it felt wrong. Subtly, unmistakably wrong. Catherine noticed it in the quiet moments. The way Charlotte asked questions that weren't really questions at all. The way she searched faces for reassurance she didn't know how to ask for. There was no anger in her tone, no blame, only uncertainty, shaped by something she didn't fully understand but couldn't let go of. That was the first alarm. Children don't invent doubt like that on their own. Doubt is taught. When Charlotte finally spoke, it wasn't a confession or a complaint. It was tentative, almost apologetic, as if she were worried the question itself might be disloyal. She spoke about her mother in careful terms, repeating phrases that didn't sound like her own, phrases that carried the weight of adult interpretation. William heard it immediately. The cadence, the distance, the unmistakable echo of someone else's voice behind his daughter's words. What made it worse was what wasn't said. There was no claim of wrongdoing, no dramatic accusation, just a suggestion that some things were complicated, that people make choices, that sometimes mothers are busy in ways children don't understand. Those words, delivered without cruelty, were far more dangerous than an outright attack. They invited Charlotte to question without giving her the tools to resolve what she was questioning. In that moment, William understood the precision of it. This wasn't careless conversation. This wasn't accidental phrasing. The language had been chosen to sound harmless while doing real damage. It placed a child in the impossible position of evaluating the person she trusted most. It turned innocence into a vulnerability, and trust into something fragile and conditional. Psychologists inside the palace would later describe this kind of influence as deeply destabilizing. Children absorb meaning differently. Authority carries more weight. When doubt comes from someone positioned above them, it embeds itself quietly, shaping perception long after the words themselves are forgotten. That was the cruelty of it. Not what Charlotte remembered, but what she would carry forward without realizing it. As the fragments came together, William felt the shift from concern to certainty. This wasn't about misinterpretation. It wasn't about sensitivity. It was about intent. And once that intent became clear, restraint was no longer an option. As the pieces began to fall into place, William understood this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was something far more deliberate. The most dangerous statements aren't the ones spoken plainly, they're the ones wrapped in suggestion. Camilla's words, according to insiders, were never direct. They didn't accuse. They implied. They framed Catherine not as wrong, but as distant. Not as flawed, but as human in ways a child shouldn't be asked to process. And William, once he decoded what was truly said, felt something shift inside him. What made the exchange so unsettling was the narrative hidden beneath its softness. Catherine wasn't criticized outright. Instead, she was subtly repositioned. A mother whose responsibilities were heavy. A woman whose role demanded sacrifices. A figure whose presence, while loving, could be interpreted as conditional or divided. To an adult, this might sound like nuance. To a child, it becomes meaning. And meaning, once formed, is hard to unlearn. Ambiguity is powerful precisely because it avoids confrontation. There is nothing to refute, nothing to correct directly. That is why it lingers. William understood this instantly. An outright insult could have been addressed, even neutralized. But implication seeps in quietly, reshaping perception without announcing itself. It invites the listener to draw conclusions on their own, making those conclusions feel personal, earned, and therefore more difficult to challenge. Within that ambiguity sat an unspoken tension that had existed for years. Maternal authority inside the royal family is never just about care, it is about influence. Who shapes the emotional center of the next generation matters. Catherine had long occupied that space for her children, deliberately insulating them from internal politics. What unsettled William was the realization that someone had stepped into that space without permission, reframing it from the inside. He began to see the conversation not as a single moment, but as part of a broader pattern. The words had been gentle, but the timing had not been random. Charlotte was old enough to listen carefully, young enough to absorb without defense. She was observant, thoughtful, emotionally perceptive. That combination made her the perfect audience. Not because she could respond, but because she would remember. William's anger sharpened as understanding replaced uncertainty. This was not about expressing concern. It was about influence, about inserting an alternative lens through which Charlotte might view her mother. Trust, once destabilized, doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. And erosion is harder to detect until the damage is done. That, more than anything, convinced William this had been intentional. The more he reflected, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment. Boundaries inside the palace are tested quietly, often through small gestures that appear harmless in isolation. A comment here. A suggestion there. Each one plausible. Each one deniable. William had seen it before, directed at adults who could defend themselves. But this time the line had been crossed into territory that should have been protected absolutely. What lingered most was not what Charlotte had said, but what she hadn't. Children don't always articulate confusion fully. Sometimes they simply carry it forward, allowing it to shape how they listen, how they interpret, how they trust. William understood that whatever had been planted could not simply be removed with reassurance. It would take time, presence, care, and even then the mark would remain. But for William, understanding the message was only the beginning. The real confrontation was still ahead. William is known for control, for patience, for choosing silence over spectacle. But there are lines that erase all of that. When the full weight of the conversation became clear, those close to him say his anger was immediate and unfiltered. This wasn't royal frustration. This was a father's rage. And the palace, so used to quiet compromise, suddenly found itself bracing for impact. The reaction did not come in public statements or formal objections. It came behind closed doors, where restraint finally gave way to something raw and unmistakable. William did not shout for effect. He did not posture. His anger was contained, concentrated, and therefore far more dangerous. Those present described it as a stillness that unsettled the room, the kind that signals a decision has already been made. This was not about appearances. This was about violation. In public, nothing changed. William continued to fulfill his duties with the same measured calm, the same practiced diplomacy. To the outside world, he was steady, composed, unshaken. But privately, the intensity was unmistakable. Conversations became sharper, tolerance narrowed, every detail was replayed, every implication examined. The contrast between the man the public saw and the father grappling with betrayal could not have been more stark. What fueled his anger was not personal offense. It was protection. The realization that his child had been placed in an emotional crossfire hardened something inside him. This was not a disagreement between adults that could be managed through protocol. It was an intrusion into the sanctity of his family, an act that ignored the one boundary he considered absolute. Once crossed, it could not be negotiated back into place. Advisors moved quickly, sensing the gravity of the situation. They urged caution. They spoke of precedent, of unity, of the dangers of escalation. But their words landed flat. William was not interested in smoothing tensions or preserving appearances. He listened, but his focus was elsewhere. Damage control mattered less to him than damage done. And the damage in his mind was already real. To William, the act represented more than poor judgment. It was a violation of trust so fundamental that it redefined relationships instantly. Family, in his view, was no longer a shared space, it was a perimeter that had been breached. And once that breach occurred, consequences were inevitable. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Some access, once abused, cannot be restored. The most unsettling part was the permanence of it all. Words spoken to a child cannot be retrieved. They cannot be edited or contextualized away. William understood that whatever had been planted would require time and care to undo, if it could be undone at all. That knowledge stripped away any lingering hesitation. This was not a momentary flare of anger. It was the beginning of something final. As resolve replaced fury, those around him sensed the shift. This was no longer about processing what had happened. It was about responding to it. And as William's anger sharpened into resolve, attention quietly turned to the woman at the center of it all. There was no apology, no clarification, no attempt to soften the moment. Camilla's response or lack of one only intensified the fallout. Those expecting damage control were met instead with restraint so tight it felt intentional. In royal circles, silence is never empty. And this silence carried weight. It suggested confidence, or defiance, or the belief that what was said didn't cross a line at all. In the immediate aftermath, many assumed a statement would follow. A quiet reassurance. A private explanation. Anything that acknowledged the gravity of what had unfolded. But nothing came. Days passed without outreach, without correction, without even the courtesy of concern. To some, it felt calculated. Silence, when wielded by someone in power, is rarely passive. It allows others to fill the void, to doubt their own reactions, to question whether they are overreacting. Inside the palace, the effect was electric. Staff moved carefully, speaking in lowered voices. sensing that something delicate had shifted. The absence of response became its own message, one that rippled through corridors and conversations alike. Some interpreted it as certainty and unspoken declaration that nothing inappropriate had occurred. Others saw it as a test, a deliberate pause designed to see who would flinch first. What unsettled many was the confidence behind it. Camilla did not appear hurried. There was no sign of concern that boundaries might have been crossed. That composure fed the perception that she believed her position insulated her from consequence. Status, after all, has long acted as armor within the institution. The higher one stands, the less often they are challenged. Silence, in that context, becomes a reminder of where power still rests. The emotional divide within the family widened with every passing day. On one side was outrage, sharpened by parental instinct and moral clarity. On the other was stillness, unmoved and unyielding. The lack of acknowledgement did more damage than a confrontation ever could. It left wounds exposed, unanswered, and therefore festering. Without dialogue, trust had nowhere to go but inward, turning into resentment. Even those accustomed to royal restraint felt the tension. Advisors exchanged glances. Longtime aides grew uneasy. Silence had stopped being neutral and started to feel confrontational in its own right. It forced others to act, to react, to make choices they might otherwise have avoided. And perhaps that was the point. Silence shifts the burden. It places responsibility on everyone else to either accept the situation or escalate it. For William, the message was unmistakable. This was not remorse. This was not reflection. This was positioning. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became that silence was being used as leverage, not humility. It hardened his resolve. What might have been addressed quietly now demanded response. What might have been contained now threatened to spill outward. Because silence does not de-escalate anger, it concentrates it. It sharpens it. It gives it time to mature into something deliberate and unstoppable. And as days passed without a word, the palace began to understand that this quiet was not calming the storm. It was feeding it. Because the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became William was not going to let this end quietly. While the palace focused on William's anger, Catherine was left carrying something heavier. She didn't rage. She didn't demand answers. Instead, she listened to her daughter, to her husband, to the echoes of a narrative she'd worked years to shield her children from. And in that silence, a different kind of devastation unfolded, one rooted in betrayal rather than confrontation. Catherine's first instinct was not defense, but assessment. She heard the uncertainty in Charlotte's voice and recognized it immediately, not as rebellion, not as misunderstanding, but as something newly introduced. Doubt does not naturally grow in a child who feels secure. It arrives from elsewhere. That realization settled quietly, painfully, and with a weight that did not lift. This was not about her reputation. It was about the internal world of a child she had spent years protecting from exactly this kind of confusion. What haunted her most was the long view. Catherine understood, perhaps better than anyone, how early impressions linger. Children don't catalog moments. They absorb them. A single suggestion can resurface years later as hesitation, as distance, as an unspoken question about trust. She knew this wasn't something that could be undone with a conversation or softened with reassurance alone. Repair would take time, presence, and an unbroken sense of safety, things that could not be rushed. Her restraint was deliberate. Catherine chose calm not because she was unaffected, but because she understood the stakes. Any visible fracture would ripple outward, amplifying harm rather than containing it. So she focused inward. She recalibrated routines. She paid closer attention to questions asked and questions avoided. She made herself unmistakably present, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet consistency that rebuilds trust piece by piece. There was also the unmistakable ache of being targeted through her child. Catherine did not need anyone to say it aloud. The realization formed on its own, sharp and unavoidable. Whatever the intent, the result had placed Charlotte between adult dynamics she should never have had to navigate. That knowledge cut deeper than public criticism ever could. It wasn't an attack she could confront, it was a wound she had to tend privately. Amid the growing tension, Catherine became the stabilizing force without announcing herself as such. She grounded William when anger threatened to overtake strategy. She centered Charlotte when confusion threatened to grow roots. She absorbed the emotional weight so others didn't have to carry it. That role, so often invisible, was the one she inhabited most naturally and most painfully. What made her response powerful was its humanity. There was no calculation in it, no political maneuvering. This was a mother responding to a breach of trust with dignity rather than spectacle. Her silence was not avoidance, it was containment. She refused to let the situation define her family publicly, even as it reshaped them privately. But dignity does not freeze time. It does not stop consequences from unfolding. Even as Catherine held her composure, the atmosphere around them continued to shift. Conversations changed. Access tightened. Trust recalibrated itself along new lines. What had been stable now felt provisional, as though everyone were waiting for the next movement beneath the surface. But even Catherine's composure couldn't stop the palace from shifting around them. This wasn't just about what was said. It was about what can never be unsaid. In royal families, legacy is shaped as much by memory as by ceremony. And the memory of this moment of boundaries crossed and trust fractured now sits quietly in the background of every interaction. The question is no longer who was right. It's what comes next. Long after tempers cool, moments like this settle into the structure of a family. They change how rooms feel, how conversations begin and end, what is shared freely, and what is withheld. Trust does not collapse loudly in institutions built on restraint. It thins. It becomes conditional. And once that happens, relationships shift in ways that are subtle but permanent. The warmth that once existed is replaced by calculation, and calculation becomes habit. One of the first changes came quietly, almost invisibly. Access tightened. Time became managed. What had once been informal and familiar began to carry rules that didn't need to be announced to be felt. Children, once a shared emotional space, became clearly defined territory. Protection replaced openness. Presence replaced assumption. These weren't punishments. They were safeguards born not from paranoia, but from experience. For William, the incident clarified something that had been evolving for years. His role had always balanced duty and family, but now the order had shifted. Protector came first, heir came second. That distinction mattered. It shaped decisions in ways advisors could sense even if they couldn't articulate them. Where compromise might once have been considered, certainty now took its place. William was no longer reacting to a moment, he was preparing for a future shaped by it. What made this turning point so powerful was its ordinariness. There was no scandal in the traditional sense, no document, no headline-grabbing confrontation, just a conversation and its aftermath. But history inside royal families is often defined by these quiet fractures. They are the moments that change how people see one another long after the event itself fades from public view. Future interactions now carried an undercurrent of caution. Words were chosen more carefully, intentions scrutinized more closely. Even gestures of goodwill felt tentative, as though everyone understood that restoration would take time if it came at all. The ease of before was gone, replaced by a new normal that no one had officially acknowledged, but everyone recognized. What lingered most was the unresolved tension, not anger, something more enduring. A sense that the issue had not been closed, only contained. Containment is not resolution. It is a pause. And pauses in families built on tradition and memory can stretch for years. They can become the space where relationships quietly redefine themselves. In moments like this, the future is shaped not by declarations but by patterns. Who speaks first? Who is included? Who is protected? Over time, these patterns harden into expectation, and expectation becomes legacy. The palace would move forward, it always does, but it would move forward changed, carrying the imprint of this moment into every decision that followed. Because some moments don't fade with time, they define it. Royal history is filled with scandals, betrayals, and power struggles, but the most lasting damage is often done in whispers. A sentence, a suggestion, a moment a child carries into adulthood. What Camilla told Charlotte may never appear in official records, but its consequences are already etched into the family's future. And for William, one truth is now unshakable: some lines, once crossed, are permanent. There will be no clean ending to this story, no document to file away, no statement to smooth the edges. What remains is memory, and memory is the most unforgiving witness of all. It lingers in tone and timing, in pauses that stretch a beat too long, in glances that avoid rather than invite. Inside the family, trust has shifted from something assumed to something measured, and that change alone is enough to alter everything that follows. What matters now is not proving intent, but living with impact. The emotional stakes outweigh any need for factual resolution. A child heard something she was never meant to carry. A father recognized the danger too late to prevent it, but not too late to respond. And a family that once moved by instinct now moves by caution. The past is no longer a place they return to, it's a line they've crossed. There is no going back to before the hesitation, before the recalibration, before the quiet decisions that redefined access and presence. Relationships that once flowed naturally now move through filters, shaped by what might be said as much as what is spoken. That loss of ease is subtle, but profound. It changes how people show up for one another, and how much they reveal when they do. William's anger, often misunderstood from the outside, was never about dominance or pride. It was about protection. It was the instinctive response of a parent who saw a boundary violated and understood the cost of ignoring it. His resolve hardened not in the heat of the moment, but in the clarity that followed. Some reactions look explosive only because they defend something fragile. Camilla's intentions remained deliberately unresolved. Perhaps the words were chosen without foresight. Perhaps they were spoken with confidence born of position. Or perhaps they were shaped by a belief that influence is earned quietly. The truth may never be fully known, and in many ways it no longer matters. Impact does not require confession to exist. It simply requires memory. What lingers is not confrontation, but distance, not closure, but recalibration. The palace will continue to function as it always does, but the emotional architecture beneath it has changed. The family will move forward, but not untouched, not unchanged. The silence that follows is not peace, it is adjustment. And in that quiet, the truth settles into place. Not all damage announces itself with drama. Some arrives softly, carried on words meant to sound harmless, and stays long after voices fade. And in the quiet that follows, the palace is left to reckon with a truth it can't escape: some damage is done not with actions, but with words. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.